Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Zachary Strong, and I am a physicist, psychology researcher, and biblical scholar. And today I'm going to be talking very briefly about artificial intelligence and Kabbalah. So, there's been a lot of talk in various circles about artificial intelligence, as you might imagine, and some people, including Tucker Carlson, are relating artificial intelligence to Kabbalah and the occult and so on. And this interview he did is like an hour and a half long. I watched all the parts that have to do with Kabbalah, and like what he's discussing in that interview has almost nothing to do with actual Kabbalah. And I figured I would, make a video to talk about these topics a little bit. So, just as a little bit of background, I am a biblical scholar operating in the ultra Orthodox Jewish tradition. So, as you can see, I'm not a Jew. I'm a Noahide, which is a non Jew that follows ultra Orthodox Judaism. And as part of my work, I study Kabbalah. So, if you check out my channel, I've got a bunch of different videos on Kabbalah, etc. But this one is going to be talking specifically about technology and artificial intelligence and the spirituality of AI. So, in order to discuss this topic, we have to start with the metaphysical outlook of Kabbalah. Because Kabbalah is not just a set of practices and so on, there's also a metaphysical cosmology behind all of these things, right? Which is the cosmology that I subscribe to, which because I believe it's correct. So anyway, in Kabbalah, within Judaism, there's our universe. Okay, we've got our little physical universe, and then surrounding the universe are spiritual realms. Okay, and there's multiple spiritual realms, and you go from super spiritual at the outside to spiritual, spiritual on the inside, and then our universe. Okay, so there's a progression from physical to spiritual. Now, in Judaism, in Kabbalah, everything that happens in our universe is a reflection of something going on in the spiritual realms. Okay, so for example, the war between Russia and Ukraine right now, for whatever reason, the spiritual forces behind Russia and the spiritual forces behind Ukraine came into conflict, and that manifested in our world as a physical war. And the same thing between Persia, Iran, and Israel. Okay, those spiritual forces came into conflict, and now there's a war. So everything in our physical universe has counterparts in the spiritual realms, and typically things happen in the spiritual realms and they cascade down to our universe. Now, interestingly, if you apply this kind of logic to technology, what we find is something very interesting. So, technology really exploded starting about 200 years ago with the steam engine and the power loom. So over the last 200 years, we've developed complex machinery that allows us to just manufacture lots of different things. We've developed modern medicine, treatments for all kinds of different things. We've developed the ability to revive people who are clinically dead. We've developed psychology. We've developed, quantum physics and everything related to that, lasers, all sorts of stuff. And we've developed computation and artificial intelligence. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, what is going on in the spiritual realms that results in artificial intelligence and modern computing and the internet and so on? Like, what's going on there? And as far as I can tell, based on my research and my pondering on these topics, this is what's going on. So, what we've essentially done with technology is give ourselves powers beyond powers beyond what we would typically have as humans. So, for example, we'll take clothes manufacturing. With modern weaving and textiles machinery, we're able to mass produce clothes that would take hours or days for someone to produce by hand. Okay, so we've given ourselves powers of creation and the ability to affect our physical world in such a way where we can just do more. And so in a spiritual sense, what we're doing with, say, manufacturing is we're unlocking powers of creation. And so we're essentially gaining powers, as a species. Now, we'll move from that to modern computing. So with computers and, especially the internet, we've now gained the ability to connect with each other and share information at a scale that was previously thought unimaginable. So, for example, let's say I have a thought or I see a funny cat meme or something. I can use my cell phone to send that to all of my friends instantly, and now they have whatever I'm thinking, or they have access to the cat meme or whatever. And so what we've essentially unlocked from the perspective of the internet is telepathy. Okay, as a species, we are unlocking telepathy. And so in a spiritual sense, what that means is, as a species, because remember, like, we all have souls, our souls all exist in the spiritual realms. The level of oneness and unity that we experience in the spiritual realms, that is now beginning to be reflected in the physical world. Okay, because now we're developing essentially a form of telepathy. We're able to communicate with each other on a worldwide basis and so on. And what we're doing as a species is unlocking oneness and unity. Now, obviously, before I get into AI, obviously, the internet and everything has come with, some growing pains. Because if you look online, there's a lot of debates that happen and, like, really harsh, speech and people defaming each other and all sorts of things. So the internet has come with some growing pains. We're not necessarily experiencing the level of unity that we would have, in the spiritual realms. We're not exactly a unified species. And at a surface level, if you look at the internet, it seems like it's enabled more disunity and division than ever. However, those are just some growing pains, essentially, because what we're now in the process of as a species is understanding how to exist as a worldwide unified entity. We're kind of learning as we go. And, obviously that comes with making some mistakes along the way and so on. So that's kind of what we're doing with the internet. Now with AI, right? With AI, what is going on spiritually with AI? And in order to understand this, we have to look at the first chapter of the book of Genesis. And in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, God creates the universe and all sorts of things with the power of speech. And even you might have heard the term abracadabra. It actually means I create as I speak. It's an old Aramaic term. Abracadabra means I create as I speak. And if you think about what AI is, large language models, you go to ChatGPT, you type something in, and it creates for you. Or you go to, an image producing thing like Midjourney or Kling.ai, which makes videos. You type in what you want, and it creates the video for you. Okay, and so what we've actually done with AI is we're beginning to unlock the creative power of speech, which in some sense is a godlike power. It's a godlike power. Now, if you talk to people like Tucker Carlson and his guests, and various people who talk about AI and the occult or whatever, they immediately associate it with like a demonic thing and the occult and so on and so on. And it's technically incorrect. It's technically incorrect. A Kabbalistic viewpoint on the internet is our species is unlocking oneness. The Kabbalistic viewpoint on AI is that we're unlocking, I suppose you could say, the creative power of speech. Okay, so we're gaining power as a species, right? And Tucker Carlson and various people pick up on that. They're like, okay, these tools are very powerful, and so on. Like, to some extent, I think various thinkers have identified that AI and so on is giving us godlike powers, and so they immediately associate that with a bad thing. But it's actually a very good thing, provided we use the power for good and responsibly and so on. You know. However, I will say this: if you look at the people in charge of these tools and the governments that make use of them and so on, you have people like Peter Thiel, who, as far as I know, is an atheist, and he's created Palantir, which is, military AI driven tracking, and it's used for surveillance and targeting drone strikes and so on, right? So people look at some of the major uses of AI, particularly in government and military, and they're like, oh, this is very, very bad. It's very, very bad. And to a large extent, it is not great. You know, Palantir surveilling citizens in democratic countries and doing predictive things on who needs to be arrested and so on, like it's not great, you know. And so we have to ask ourselves, from a Kabbalistic viewpoint, what exactly is going on here with AI surveillance and Palantir and the tech giants and the governments and so on? Like, what's going on here, right? And really what it comes down to is atheists attempting to use these technologies to become gods, right? I would say, like, governments and the atheists in charge of big tech and so on, they have correctly identified that the technologies that we have are extremely powerful, and they give us essentially godlike powers, right? But because they don't have a theistic viewpoint, because they do not recognize God as the source of all existence and the person who's, or the thing who's really in charge of everything, right? They don't see that. To them, they are the center of the universe, or if they're somewhat altruistic, they see the species as the center of the universe, right? And so, in the hands of people who don't have a robust belief in God and a robust understanding of, divine metaphysics and so on, AI is just a tool to control. It's just a tool to control the environment, control other people. It's a control thing, right? And I think that's where people like Tucker Carlson have identified that, like, there's some occult stuff here. This is bad. This is the Antichrist. This is the mark of the beast or whatever. It's because the tools are being used to control and exploit, rather than to create and uplift and empower and so on, as they should be, So I think that's where some of this stuff is coming from, where it is a recognition that, Palantir and some of these other surveillance technologies and the algorithms of social media and blah blah blah, like it's being used as a tool to control and exploit resources, other people, etc. However, from a Kabbalistic viewpoint, from a Jewish viewpoint, what's actually happening here is very, very exciting. Because human beings are created in the image of God, right? We learn that in, the first couple chapters of Genesis. They're created in the image of God, which means that we have various qualities and abilities that are godlike. And that includes, for example, the ability to unify as a species. Okay, in the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, chapter 4, it says that God is one. And in the same sense, the whole human species is one entity. So God is one, and we are also one. And so the internet has actually given us the ability to realize that capacity, right? And obviously we're not using it as well as we could and so on. But it's some growing pains. We're essentially growing into this unified oneness that reflects the spiritual oneness. Okay, so that's the internet. And then with AI, we're unlocking the creative powers of speech, right? We're actually able to create as we speak. Mid-Journey, paint me a picture of this. Boom, it's done, right? So we're actually able to create as we speak more than ever before. And so this is actually really, really exciting from a Kabbalistic standpoint, because what it shows is that as a species, we are progressing more and more to reflect the spiritual realities that exist. Okay? In the spiritual worlds, we have essentially creative power. In the spiritual worlds, we are unified, right? There's no division, no hatred, anything like that. And so we're actually growing into that, right? And the internet and AI are a big part of that. So what's actually happening is very, very exciting, and so that's kind of what I wanted to share. The main takeaway here is that our physical world is a manifestation of whatever's going on in the spiritual realms. And the development of the internet, the development of AI is showing that we are progressing more and more to embody the spiritual realities that our higher souls, our upper souls, already have. So for me, for example, I use AI a whole bunch. If you check out my channel, I've got a poem called Ascent to Transcendence. I wrote that mostly myself. I used AI to help me with a couple of lines in the poem that I was struggling with. So AI provided an assist there, but I also used AI to animate the whole thing, right? Which if I wanted to do that, just myself, I would have needed to hire a film team and all of that. But with AI, I could just animate the whole thing in the span of about 5 days. So it's really exciting. AI is quite fun, As a creative, as an artist, like you can see I'm a musician here, AI gives me the ability to extend my creative capacity to create more and do more, I haven't used AI for music yet because I enjoy the physical process of writing music, but when it comes to animating things and creating visuals and so on, like, I enjoy using AI for that, So it's very, very exciting. And obviously, like the internet, I enjoy using the internet. Ever since I was 13, I've basically been, a heavy internet user, with forums and IRC and now YouTube. And, I'm excited for these capacities, right? And It's unfortunate that, these technologies are being used for bad purposes right now. Um, However, for you as an individual, learning how to use AI, learning how to bring your ideas to life, learning how to use the internet responsibly and benefit from all the knowledge and connection that's available. Um, yeah, I would encourage, people to do more of that, and not necessarily to condemn the technology out of hand as some are doing. So anyway, that's my thoughts on Kabbalah and AI. I've got a whole bunch of other videos on Kabbalah and biblical metaphysics on my channel, so make sure to check out some of that if you're interested. Thanks very much, and God bless.